Do you believe in eugenics? In today's topic, we're going to explore how eugenics remains an integral part of our human society. Hello, fellow packmates. This is Jennifer Steckel from the Direwolf Project, where science meets the Ice Age. We're the only breeding program in the world recreating the exact bone and body structure of the extinct prehistoric dire wolf. Not for the wild, but for your loving family den, using only domesticated dog breeds. I've been raising these incredible American Direst dogs for over 20 years, delivering 73 litters and over 400 loyal pups to the world. You want to track upcoming litters or see which puppies are ready to join your pack? Join the inner circle at direwolfproject.com. If you love prehistoric pups and pack-centered wisdom, give us a like, hit subscribe, and let's step out of the den together. To understand why eugenics took hold so firmly in the late 1800s, we have to see the world as Victorians saw it. By the late 19th century, Western society was riding a powerful current of confidence. Science had begun to illuminate mysteries that once seemed permanently veiled. Diseases were being classified, inheritance was being studied. Statistics promised to reveal order beneath human complexity. Life itself appeared newly legible, as though nature had agreed to sit still enough to be measured. Eugenics emerged from that confidence. It presented itself as responsible by borrowing from practices already trusted and admired. Gardeners saved seed from their strongest plants and watched their beds flourish the following season. Livestock breeders recorded lineages, selected pairings, and produced animals that behaved more and more predictably with each generation. Horsemen refined lines of speed, strength, and tractability, and proudly displayed these results. These were not fringe pursuits. They were symbols of progress and mastery in a rapidly modernizing world. Applying similar reasoning to human society, well, that felt like prudence extended, not cruelty invented. Eugenics also wrapped itself in the authority of modern science. Family trees were drawn with the care of legal documents. Traits were cataloged and compared. Intelligence tests were proposed as impartial instruments. Tables and charts filled academic journals, giving the impression that personal judgment had been replaced by objective scientific fact. Decisions made under this framework felt inevitable rather than ideological, as though one were simply following the evidence wherever it led. Perhaps most compelling of all, eugenics presented itself as compassionate. Advocates spoke of alleviating suffering before it began. They argued that discouraging certain unions would spare future generations from illness, poverty, and dependency. Institutions were framed as places of care and protection. Restrictions were described as preventative medicine applied to society itself. The language was careful, restrained, and often couched in concern, like a physician advising restraint for the sake of long-term health. In that context, encouraging the quote-unquote fit to reproduce was cast as a public good. Discouraging the quote unfit was framed as kindness, even mercy. Society, it was believed at the time, could be guided towards stability and improvement through thoughtful management, much as a careful naturalist might tend a collection to preserve its most desirable specimens. That is what made eugenics persuasive. It did not ask people to abandon their moral instincts. It asked them to trust those instincts and refine them with science. It promised order during a time of industrial upheaval and social change. It offered predictability in a world where class structures, cities, and economies were shifting faster than many people could comfortably follow. The tragedy lay not in the desire for improvement, which was a good, but in the assumption that life could be perfected by narrowing what was allowed to participate. Once a person's worth became something to be measured, ranked, and managed, exclusion no longer appeared cruel. It appeared sensible even. And when harm followed, well, that was just explained as unfortunate but necessary, consequence of progress, rather than as evidence that the framework itself was fundamentally flawed. This is why eugenics must be understood as it was first presented, not as a symbol of obvious evil, but as a philosophy that believed it was guiding society toward a better future. Only by understanding that original appeal can we recognize how its assumptions still echo today, shaping what we call responsible, scientific, or protective, long after the costs have become impossible to ignore. That is the historical ground beneath our feet as we continue forward into the next section. So where did eugenics go wrong? Eugenics went wrong when it stopped treating evidence as a guide and began treating it as an inconvenience. In its early years, eugenics claimed to be responsible to observation, scientific observation. When problems appeared, reformers promised adjustment. Yet, as eugenics policies spread, a troubling pattern emerged. When outcomes failed to improve after time, the response was never to question the philosophy of eugenics itself. Instead, the proponents concluded that it had not been applied firmly enough. One of the clearest examples appeared in early 20th century sterilization laws. These policies were introduced with language that sounded medical and humane. Legislators argued that preventing certain people from reproducing, well, that would reduce poverty, illness, and institutional dependence. All very good things to want. The individuals affected were also often described as being spared their hardship, both for themselves and for the society. But when those measures failed to produce the promised social improvements, well, the laws were never repealed. They were expanded. States broadened the categories of people deemed, quote, unfit. Disability, poverty, illiteracy, and even nonconformity were treated as hereditary defects. Judges approved sterilizations with little review. Consent became irrelevant. What had been framed as preventative care became enforced control, administered through hospitals, courts, and prisons, all under the banner of responsibility. A similar shift occurred in marriage restrictions. Laws were passed to prevent certain unions, justified as protection of the public good. Couples were barred from marrying one another based on diagnoses, ancestry, or social standing. These decisions were not made by families or physicians acting with personal knowledge, but by clerks and government officials following standardized criteria. Individual lives were subordinated to abstract ideals of improvement. And once eugenics entered the legal code, compassion narrowed rapidly. People were no longer seen as whole individuals with a complex of circumstances. They became categories. A person could be declared unworthy of production by a form, a test score, or a family history chart. And appeals were rare. Outcomes were irrelevant. The presence of authority replaced the need for humility. This same logic appeared in institutional settings as well. Large facilities were established to house those labeled unfit. They presented as places of care and protection, but in practice, they often became warehouses of neglect. Overcrowding, poor conditions, and loss of autonomy were justified as necessary sacrifices for the greater plan. The original promise to reduce suffering, well, it quietly dissolved, and it was replaced by a focus on maintaining order within the society. The most telling sign of failure was the response to criticism. When journalists, physicians, and clergy raised concerns about the abuse and ineffectiveness of eugenics, they were dismissed as, well, you're just sentimental or you're unscientific. Evidence that contradicted the eugenics claims were labeled anecdotal. The system insulated itself from correction by declaring itself the authority on what correction should look like. And by that point, well, cruelty no longer required malice at all. It functioned through paperwork, policy, and procedure. Decisions were made at a distance without ever encountering the people who were affected by those policies. Harm became invisible to those administering it because it had been normalized by law and justified by theory. The same pattern appeared wherever eugenics was applied. Once government control replaced stewardship and certainty replaced humility, then the framework lost its ability to recognize suffering. It no longer asked whether lives were improving. It asked only whether rules were being followed. And this is how a philosophy that began by promising compassion arrived at outcomes devoid of any compassion at all. Not through sudden violence, but through gradual legalism. Not through hatred, but through confidence, overconfidence. The belief that the system knew mattered more than the reality unfolding in front of it. Eugenics failed not because people abandoned the care they once had for those individuals, but because care was redirected away from the outcomes and toward the ideology itself. When a system stops measuring itself by the lives it touches, it will always drift toward harm, no matter how noble its beginnings. This is the lesson history leaves behind, written plainly for those willing to read it. So why is the Direwolf Project talking about eugenics? Isn't that just a human problem? Well, actually no. Eugenics not only started in the Victorian age for humans, but it also transferred to all kinds of other animals, including dogs. The same way of thinking did not stop at human society. It crossed quite naturally into the breeding of animals, especially those kept by the aristocracy, where control, status, and display already shaped how worth was understood. By the mid to late Victorian period, animal breeding had shifted from a largely practical endeavor into a symbolic one. Dogs had once been evaluated primarily by what they could do. A hound proved itself by tracking game across rough country. A guardian proved itself by discernment and steadiness. A herding dog earned its place through endurance and judgment. Performance anchored the value, and breeding decisions followed observable performance results. But that anchor began to loosen in the Victorian era. As pedigrees became fashionable, ancestry itself took a brand new role. A dog's lineage was no longer simply a record of where it came from, but a claim about what it was presumed to be. Long written pedigrees, carefully preserved and publicly displayed, became social currency. Breeding shifted away from selecting animals that performed best in the field or home, and towards selecting animals that reinforced the prestige of a name. This was presented as refinement. Elite breeders spoke of improving type, elevating form, and preserving distinction. Dogs were increasingly bred to conform to written standards that emphasized outward features associated with aristocratic taste. Head shape, coat texture, head carriage, body carriage, and proportion were elevated as signs of superior breeding. These traits were judged in controlled settings, far removed from the original environments where dogs had historically proven themselves. Performance quietly slipped into the background. A dog no longer needed to hunt effectively, guard reliably, or endure physical hardship in order to be considered exemplary. Instead, it needed to look correct, according to the fashion of the day, and trace its ancestry to approved lines. Function became secondary to form, and form became a stand-in for assumed quality. This shift carried a powerful psychological appeal. If superiority could be recognized at a glance, well, then it could be owned, displayed, and defended. A well-bred dog became an emblem of discernment and social standing, much like fine china or a carefully curated library. Breeding decisions followed aesthetic ideals rather than biological outcomes, because aesthetics were easier to control and far easier to admire. Here is where eugenics thinking fully took root in animal breeding. Once pedigree and appearance were treated as proof of quality, the actual well-being of the animal could be set aside without appearing negligent. Structural exaggerations were praised as refinement. Reduced stamina was dismissed as inconsequential. Shortened working life was tolerated because the dog's purpose had quietly changed from partner to ornament. Breeders began to select for extremes because extremes demonstrated mastery. Narrower skulls, shorter muzzles, heavier coats, steeper angles, and exaggerated outlines became signals of distinction. Each generation pushed the standard a little further, and not because dogs benefited from these changes, but because novelty and precision reinforced status. The original goal of improving stock through better outcomes, remember that was the original goal of eugenics? Well, it was replaced by the goal of producing animals that reflected taste, control, and lineage. This transformation did not require cruelty in order to feel justified. It required only the belief that humans could define superiority from the outside and that written standards carried more authority than the living bodies themselves. Once that belief settled in, the question ceased to be whether the dog thrived and became, well, whether it conformed. That is how aristocratic breeding drifted away from stewardship and toward display. The power to shape life was no longer guided by outcomes observed over time, but by ideals frozen on paper. What began as selective breeding for excellence gradually became selective breeding for vanity, all the while wearing the language of improvement and progress. The consequences of that shift would not appear immediately, though. They unfolded slowly, generation by generation, as health weakened beneath beauty and vitality narrowed beneath pedigree. By the time the cost became obvious, the framework that produced them had already been declared, well, tradition. This was not an accident. It was the logical extension of eugenics thinking applied to animals, where control and appearance replaced humility and observation, and where the ability to shape life eclipsed the responsibility to sustain it. Now let's look at some examples of canine eugenics in action. There are moments in history when the intentions are earnest. The language is careful and the consequences arrive quietly, only revealing themselves decades later. Victorian dog breeding is one of those moments. Before the rise of formal dog shows and closed registries, many familiar breeds looked very different from how we know them today. Early King Charles Spaniels, for example, were small companion dogs, but they were not structurally extreme. Paintings from the 17th and early 18th centuries show dogs with longer muzzles, flatter skulls, and heads that comfortably housed the brain they carried. They were bred to live alongside people, not to embody a fashionable ideal. But during the Victorian age, this began to change. Remember, pedigrees became prestigious. Written standards emerged, and breeding dogs became a public demonstration of refinement, science, and social standing. When aristocratic breeders gathered at dog shows, they rewarded dogs that looked increasingly delicate, youthful, and ornamental. For the King Charles Spaniel, refinement came to mean a shorter muzzle, a more domed skull, and larger, more prominent eyes. Each generation moved further in that direction. No single breeding decision appeared catastrophic. Yet, the skull grew smaller while the brain did not. Over time, this imbalance produced Chiaria-like malformation and syringomyelia, conditions that cause chronic pain and neurological suffering in many Cavalier King Charles Spaniels today. So the damage was not immediate, and it was never intended, but it was the predictable outcome of prioritizing appearance and pedigree over anatomical sufficiency. The bulldog followed the similar path. Early bulldogs were athletic animals capable of movement and endurance. When bull baiting was outlawed in 1835, the breed lost its original function. Victorian breeders then reshaped the bulldog into a symbol rather than a working animal. Wider heads, shorter muzzles, heavier bodies, and exaggerated wide stances became desirable. These traits conveyed strength and resolve, qualities admired in the culture of the time. Dog shows reinforced these preferences. Pedigrees locked those preferences in place. Health consequences were often reframed as inconveniences rather than warnings. And over generations, the bulldog became a dog that struggles to breathe, mate, give birth, and regulate its own body temperature. The breed survived as an icon, but its biological resilience steadily eroded. The pug story echoes the same theme. Early European pugs had longer muzzles and fewer respiratory challenges. As Victorian taste favored exaggerated usefulness, breeders selected for a flatter face, larger eyes, and rounder skulls. These traits were celebrated as charming and refined. Breathing difficulty, eye injury, and heat intolerance became increasingly common. Yet they were normalized as breed traits rather than signs of structural failure. In each of these cases, breeding shifted away from evaluating how well a dog lived and functioned, and toward how closely it matched an idealized image. Aristocratic breeders believed they were improving dogs by refining their appearance and preserving their pedigree, What they were actually doing was narrowing the margin of biological success. This was eugenics applied to animals, not through cruelty or neglect, but through overconfidence. Confidence that humans could define superiority by outward form. Confidence that pedigree ensured quality. And confidence that outcomes would take care of themselves. Well, they did not. The harm emerged slowly, embedded in generations and hidden beneath ribbons and titles. These breeds did not decline because their breeders lacked affection or intelligence. They declined because rigid standards replaced observation and appearance replaced function as measures of worth. That lesson remains with us today, written not in theory but in the bodies of the dogs who inherited these poor choices. And did you know that modern dog breeding rarely calls itself eugenics anymore? Yet many of its operating assumptions remain unchanged from the Victorian age. The language has softened, but many of the same eugenics logic from the Victorian age still guides breeding decisions today. In this section, we're going to talk about them. And maybe you even assumed some of them yourself. Number one of the oldest assumptions inherited from Victorian eugenics is the belief that some lives are simply more worth preserving than others. In modern dog breeding, this appears when suffering is tolerated in order to protect pedigree narratives, even when healthier alternatives already exist. The Dalmatian provides one of the clearest examples of this happening in our modern dog breeding. For decades, nearly every Dalmatian carried a genetic defect that impaired normal uric acid metabolism, leading to painful urinary stones, blockages, repeated surgeries, and even death. This was not a rare issue confined to a few lines. It was a population-wide problem. A solution was eventually introduced through a carefully planned outcross to a pointer, restoring normal uric acid function. The resulting dogs were bred back to Dalmatians and quickly became indistinguishable in appearance, temperament, and type. Their only meaningful difference was improved health and a dramatically reduced risk of life-threatening urinary disease. Yet these healthier dogs, the cross ones with the pointer, well, they were widely rejected. They were barred from registries, excluded from breeding programs, and dismissed as illegitimate for many years. Not because they failed in form and function, but because their lineage disrupted the Dalmatians' purebred status. In this case, the choice was not between preservation and chaos. It was a battle between preserving a purity ideal left over from the Victorian eugenics era over preserving the lives of the dogs themselves. The continued resistance made clear which was valued more highly. It's important to know, however, that this belief did not persist because people wished harm to the breed. On the contrary, it persisted because a purebred pedigree was treated as superior. And suffering, well, it was treated as acceptable collateral in its defense. Number two, closely related, is the belief that predictability should be valued above resilience. Victorian thinkers favored order because it felt safe and controllable. In modern dog breeding, this translates into programs that prioritize exact size, coat texture, head shape, and gait uniformity, even when those traits correlate with orthopedic breakdown, breathing impairment, or shortened lifespan. In many show-line German Shepherd populations, dogs with impressive pedigrees and titles are widely used for breeding despite clear orthopedic instability and shortened working longevity. At the same time, healthier dogs with sound structure are excluded if they lack the, quote, right ancestry. Number 3. Another enduring belief carried forward from Victorian eugenics is the idea that purity itself produces quality. In the 19th century, purity was treated as visible evidence of superiority, a sign that refinement had been achieved and disorder excluded. That same logic persists today whenever closed systems are defended, even as biological failure becomes impossible to ignore. The Cavalier King Charles Spaniel stands at the center of this belief and its consequences, as we discussed. The modern breed descends from an extreme genetic bottleneck, having been reconstructed after the Second World War from as few as 6 individuals. That narrow foundation permanently limited genetic diversity, yet the registry remained closed and purity was preserved as a virtue rather than questioned as a risk. Over time, the cost became unmistakable. A large portion of Cavaliers suffer from syringomyelia and Chiari-like malformation, conditions caused by skulls that are too small to accommodate the brain. Dogs live with chronic pain, neurological impairment, and reduced quality of life. Alongside this, mitral valve disease has become nearly universal within the breed, often appearing early and progressing relentlessly. By middle age, many Cavaliers are already in heart failure. These are not isolated defects, they are breed-wide patterns. Additional issues include brachiocephalic airway obstruction, hip dysplasia, and chronic ear disease, and those all compound the burden on that particular dog breed. Health testing protocols have now been introduced, and some breeders have adopted advanced cardiac screening, yet the underlying genetic reality remains unchanged because the genetic diversity of the breed is so low. Testing can delay those symptoms, but it cannot restore diversity that no longer exists. The ethical implications eventually became impossible to dismiss. In Norway, the cumulative evidence led to a landmark legal decision. Courts ruled that continued breeding of Cavalier King Charles Spaniels violated the country's Animal Welfare Act, on the grounds that it is not realistically possible to produce healthy puppies under current breeding standards. The ruling effectively banned breeding from the breed altogether, not as a symbolic gesture, but as a recognition that the system itself had failed those dogs. What makes this case particularly sobering is that it did not unfold in ignorance. The problems were well documented. They were discussed within veterinary and breeding communities for decades. Yet the registry remained closed, and calls for meaningful genetic correction were resisted because introducing new blood was perceived as a greater threat than continued suffering. Even recent debates within breeder circles, such as disputes over non-standard coat colors like chocolate Cavaliers, reveal how tightly identity is guarded. Energy is often spent policing appearance, while the biological foundation of the breed continues to erode beneath it. This is where the belief in purity reveals its cost. When maintaining an ideal becomes more important than sustaining life, the system protects itself while the animals endure the consequences. The intention may be care, but the outcome is predictable and repeatable. The Cavalier's story shows that purity does not guarantee quality. It can just as easily preserve fragility, lock in pain, and prevent recovery. When correction is forbidden in principle, decline becomes inevitable in practice. This is not a failure of compassion. It is a failure of a fundamental breeding framework. And it illustrates with painful clarity how a Victorian idea left unchallenged can persist long after its harm is fully visible. Number 4. From the belief in purity flows a closely related fear, the fear that mixing leads to degeneration. In Victorian eugenics, any deviation from the sanctioned line was treated as corruption rather than correction. That same anxiety still appears in modern dog breeding today whenever genetic variation is rejected on principle, even before outcomes are examined. The controversy surrounding the natural bobtail Rottweilers illustrates this clearly. As tail docking has been restricted or banned in many countries, some breeders and registries have confronted an uncomfortable reality. The traditional appearance of a docked Rottweiler was never entirely natural, yet it became culturally entrenched as part of the breed's identity. When naturally short-tailed Rottweilers began to reappear and be discussed openly, the response was not curiosity but alarm. Rather than asking whether a naturally bobtailed dog could move well, balance properly, or communicate effectively and live a healthy life, much of the debate centered on whether the trait belonged within the officially sanctioned pedigree narrative. In some countries, the natural bobtail was treated as a deformity by default. In others, it was threatened with relegation to limited registration, effectively removing those dogs from breeding programs regardless of their health, function, or behavior. What makes this case particularly revealing is that natural bobtails exist in other breeds without catastrophic consequence. Pembroke Welsh Corgis, for example, carry a naturally short tail without widespread spinal collapse. This does not automatically validate every bobtail expression in every breed, but it does undermine the assumption that deviation itself is proof of degeneration. The Rottweiler debate rarely discussed measured outcomes. Instead, the discussions were largely surrounded by standards, symbolism, and lineage purity. Even when historical evidence suggested that bobtails existed within early Rottweiler populations, the prevailing response favored exclusion over historical investigation. The possibility of responsibly integrating variation into the breed was treated as a threat rather than an opportunity. In this way, the natural bobtail Rottweiler became less a question of health and more a question of allegiance. The system was defended first, and the dogs were considered second. That ordering reveals the same logic Victorian eugenics relied upon, where correction was framed as contamination and preservation of an ideal outweighed the lived reality of the animals themselves. Remember, this belief persists not because people wish harm to the dogs, but because purity narratives feel safer than uncertainty. Yet when deviation is rejected before it is even studied, systems lose their ability to adapt, and when adaptation is forbidden, decline becomes inevitable. Number 5. Another persistent belief inherited from Victorian eugenics is that order itself justifies exclusion. In such systems, individuals who do not conform to a prescribed physical ideal, they're simply removed. Not because they fail to thrive, but because their existence disrupts uniformity. The Rhodesian Ridgeback offers one of the clearest modern examples of this logic at work. The breed is defined by a distinctive ridge of hair growing in the opposite direction along the spine. This ridge is not simply decorative. It is the result of a genetic mutation that is closely linked to dermoid sinus, a congenital defect that can lead to severe infection, neurological damage, and death if left untreated. Ironically, puppies born without the ridge are often the healthiest in the litter. Yet for much of the breed's modern history, ridgeless puppies were considered unacceptable. They were barred from breeding and in many cases historically culled at birth despite being physically sound and behaviorally normal. Their removal was not based on suffering, instability, or inability to live full lives. It was based entirely on the absence of a cosmetic feature required by the breed standard. This creates a stark ethical inversion. Puppies carrying a mutation association with serious health risks were preserved because they fit the visual ideal of the standard, while puppies free of that mutation were discarded because they disrupted uniformity. The system rewarded appearance even when it conflicted directly with biological well-being. And over time, additional health issues emerged within the breed, including hereditary hip dysplasia and heart conditions, further highlighting the cost of prioritizing form over resilience. Yet the ridge itself remained protected as the defining feature because it symbolized identity, history, and adherence to an established standard. This is not an example of cruelty born from neglect, though. It is an example of exclusion enforced in the name of order. The framework valued conformity so highly that healthy lives were treated as expendable if they failed to match the desired outward appearance outcome. That belief did not originate in modern dog breeding. It echoes directly from Victorian eugenics, where deviation was treated as a flaw to be removed rather than variation to be understood. When systems operate this way, structure is preserved, but, well, the life quietly pays the cost. Number 6. Victorian refinement also accepted fragility as an acceptable cost of improvement. The belief was that progress required sacrifice, and that some degree of suffering was tolerable if the desired form could be achieved. That belief remains alive today whenever pain is reframed as an unavoidable trait rather than evidence of a system that is pushed beyond its limits. The English Bulldog sits at the center of this controversy. The modern Bulldog's extremely shortened skull, broad chest, narrow hips, and heavily wrinkled skin are not accidental outcomes. They are the result of deliberate human engineering, refined over generations to meet a specific aesthetic ideal. That ideal has come at a steep biological cost. Most English Bulldogs struggle to breathe normally due to brachiocephalic airway syndrome. Many live with chronic respiratory distress, exercise intolerance, and heat sensitivity. Skin fold dermatitis is common as moisture and bacteria collect in deep wrinkles that the body did not evolve to manage. Eye conditions such as cherry eye are frequent. Joint disease, particularly hip dysplasia, occurs at the highest documented rates of any breed. Reproduction itself has become a medical procedure for the English Bulldog. The majority of Bulldog puppies are delivered by cesarean section because the puppies' large heads and the mother's narrow pelvises make natural birth dangerous or even impossible. In practical terms, the breed now depends on surgical intervention simply to continue to exist. These outcomes are not rare complications either. They are expected aspect of the English Bulldog breed in general. They are discussed openly as part of Bulldog ownership and often described as, well, just manageable rather than alarming. The median lifespan of the breed remains short, hovering around 8 years, despite advances in veterinary medicine that have extended the lives of many other dogs. What makes this situation particularly revealing is that corrective pathways already exist. Veterinary bodies and genetic researchers have urged modernization of breed standards, including longer muzzles, less exaggerated skin folds, and improved pelvic structure. Others have proposed carefully managed outcrossing to restore the Bulldog's genetic diversity. especially given research from institutions such as UC Davis suggesting the bulldog gene pool is so restricted that meaningful improvement through selective breeding alone may be impossible. Yet resistance remains strong. Breed organizations often argue that careful breeding within the existing standard can resolve these issues without altering the ideal itself. The focus stays fixed on preservation of form, even as evidence accumulates that the form itself is the source of the suffering. The situation is further complicated by market demand. As bulldogs grow more popular, backyard breeding and the pursuit of so-called rarer colors, such as Merle, introduce additional risks, including blindness and deafness. These practices expose how quickly aesthetic novelty can eclipse responsibility when a breed's biology is already stretched thin. Again, none of this persists because people wish harm on their dogs. It persists because fragility has been normalized as refinement. The bulldog's struggles are treated as the price of beauty rather than as signals calling for change. This is the same logic that guided Victorian eugenics. Improvement was judged by how closely an ideal could be enforced, not by how well life functioned beneath it. When systems operate this way, suffering becomes routine and correction feels like a betrayal. The bulldog's body tells the truth plainly, though. When refinement demands constant medical intervention, the system has crossed from stewardship into control, and life pays the cost quietly, one breath at a time. Number 7, the idea that failure reflects individual weakness rather than system design is one of the most persistent legacies of Victorian eugenics. In that framework, the structure was presumed sound by definition. When problems appeared, they were blamed on the subject rather than the system that produced it. In modern dog breeding, this belief appears whenever health or behavioral instability is explained away as poor ownership, insufficient training, or bad luck, even when the same problems repeat across bloodlines. The Belgian Malinois offers a revealing case study. The Malinois is an extraordinarily capable working dog prized for intelligence, drive, speed, and responsiveness. Over the past several decades, intense demand for military, police, and sport programs has placed enormous selection pressure on the Malinois breed. Dogs that excel under extreme conditions are favored, bred, and reproduced widely. Traits such as high prey drive, rapid arousal, and relentless work ethic are consistently rewarded. At the same time, breeding pools have narrowed dramatically. A relatively small number of highly successful working lines are used repeatedly, especially internationally, because they produce predictable performance traits. This concentration increases genetic relatedness within the population, even when pedigrees appear diverse on paper due to global exchange. The consequence of this pressure is not immediately visible in the puppies. It emerges later, often as behavioral instability, poor recovery from stress, anxiety, reactivity, or difficulty transitioning into non-working environments. These dogs may struggle in ordinary households, exhibit hypervigilance, or fail to regulate their intensity without constant structure and stimulation. When this happens, responsibility is frequently placed on handlers. The narrative becomes that the dog was mishandled, underworked, or placed in the wrong home. While placement and training do matter, this explanation avoids asking a harder question: whether the breeding system itself has narrowed the margin for stable, adaptable temperaments. Genetic diversity plays a role here as well. When selection repeatedly favors extreme traits, supporting traits that buffer stress, promote emotional regulation, and allow flexibility across environments can be unintentionally sidelined. Over time, this can reduce the breed's overall adaptability, even as peak performance continued to shine. Importantly, this does not mean the Malinois is broken or poorly bred across the board. It means the system is optimized for a narrow definition of success. Dogs that fall outside that narrow band are treated as individual failures rather than as signals that the framework itself has become too rigid. This mirrors Victorian thinking precisely. When outcomes are uncomfortable, the framework remains unquestioned and the subject absorbs the blame. The system continues unchanged even as patterns repeat. The lesson here is not that demanding work produces weak dogs. It is that any breeding system that prioritizes a single extreme outcome without equal attention to resilience, recovery, and long-term stability will eventually produce fragility alongside excellence. Recognizing that truth is not an attack on the breed. It is an invitation to steward the breed more wisely. Number 8. Closely tied to this legacy is the belief that authority itself determines truth. In Victorian society, institutional approval carried extraordinary weight. An idea endorsed by the right academy, society, or governing body was treated as correct by virtue of its recognition, not because it had been proven by long-term outcomes. That same logic quietly persists today. In modern dog breeding, registry authority often functions as a substitute for evidence, and no institution illustrates this more clearly than the American Kennel Club. AKC recognition, championship titles, and registry status are widely treated as indicators of quality, responsibility, and legitimacy. Dogs, breeders, and entire breeding systems gain moral credibility simply by existing within the AKC framework. Yet structure itself requires expansion rather than correction. Over time, championship classes and trial opportunities have steadily multiplied. New venues, new titles, and new competitive pathways create incentives to produce more dogs that meet narrow visual or performance criteria, while population-level health outcomes remain secondary. Success is measured in ribbons, rankings, and registrations, not in lifespan, fertility, orthopedic durability, or freedom from chronic disease. This authority effect becomes even more visible when examining breed standards that reward extreme traits. French bulldogs, English bulldogs, pugs, and dachshunds continue to be bred toward exaggerated conformations that compromise breathing, movement, and spinal integrity, yet remain fully sanctioned within the system. The presence of a breed standard gives the impression of care and expertise, even as veterinary data shows rising medical intervention, shortened lifespans, and diminished quality of life. Institutional authority also shields the system from legislative correction. For years, the AKC has opposed hundreds of state and local animal welfare bills aimed at improving conditions in commercial breeding facilities. These objections are framed as defenses of responsible breeders. Yet the effect is to preserve a system where registration volume continues to generate revenue regardless of welfare outcomes. When oversight is resisted while suffering persists, authority functions less as stewardship and more as insulation. The AKC's Foundation Stock Service offers another revealing example. Breeds are admitted into provisional recognition pipelines not because they have demonstrated long-term genetic health, but because they can be standardized, categorized, and eventually absorbed into the registry structure. Even experimental or wolf-adjacent populations are filtered through a framework that prioritizes pedigree construction and formal recognition over biological resilience. The Coton du Tuileries controversy underscores this pattern clearly. Prior to AKC recognition, the breed was maintained by independent registries that emphasized genetic diversity, health screening, and low-volume breeding. Once AKC recognition occurred, pressure toward visual uniformity, increased demand, and commercial expansion followed. Lawsuits, breeder schisms, and documented concerns about narrowing gene pools emerged, not because breeders abandoned responsibility, but because the system rewarded conformity over restraint. In each of these cases, authority does not respond to evidence so much as it defines legitimacy in advance. Registry approval outweighs genetic data. Titles outweigh longevity. Recognition outweighs outcome. Practices persist not because they are working, but because they are sanctioned. This is not unique to the AKC, nor does it require malicious intent. It is the predictable result of a system where institutional endorsement becomes synonymous with truth. When authority is treated as evidence, the framework itself becomes untouchable, even as the living population beneath it declines. That is the Victorian inheritance at work. When outcome is uncomfortable, it's just explained away. When suffering appears, well, it's normalized. When evidence accumulates, it is subordinated to tradition. And when authority speaks, the system listens to itself rather than to the dogs. This is why stewardship cannot be outsourced to institutions alone. Any system that equates legitimacy with recognition rather than with biological success will eventually confuse control for care. Number 9. Another lingering idea inherited from Victorian eugenics is the belief that improvement requires tighter control over reproduction. In the 19th century, this logic appeared in the conviction that concentrating the best blood would accelerate progress. If one individual embodied excellence, then multiplying that individual's influence seemed not only efficient but responsible. In modern dog breeding, this belief appears most clearly through what is now called popular sire syndrome. The Golden Retriever offers a sobering example. Golden Retrievers are among the most beloved family dogs in the world, valued for their temperament, trainability, and companionship. They are also one of the most heavily registered and competitively bred breeds. Over time, this combination of popularity and competition has created strong incentives to identify a small number of standout males and use them widely. When a Golden Retriever wins consistently in the show ring, produces desirable puppies, or carries a pedigree associated with success, demand for that dog's offspring rises rapidly. Breeders across regions and even continents seek access to the same genetics, believing they are making careful, rational choices. Each individual breeding decision appears sensible on its own. The problem emerges at the population level. As the same sires are used repeatedly, their genes begin to dominate the breed. Even when the overall number of dogs remains large, genetic diversity quietly narrows over time. Pedigrees may look varied on paper, but many lines trace back to the same handful of influential males within just a few generations. This concentration has consequences. Golden Retrievers today suffer from some of the highest cancer rates of any breed, with hemangiosarcoma, lymphoma, and osteosarcoma occurring at alarming frequency. Inherited conditions such as ichthyosis, and neuronal ceroid lipofuscinosis have also spread through specific lines. In many cases, these diseases were not visible when a popular sire was first selected. They emerged later, after his genetics had already been widely distributed. Because recessive diseases can remain hidden for generations, a dog may be celebrated and heavily used long before the cost becomes apparent. By the time patterns of illness are recognized, the damage is already embedded across the population. What began as admiration for excellence becomes a bottleneck that the breed cannot easily escape. This is not the result of careless breeding. It is the result of a system that rewards concentration. As genetic diversity narrows, other signs of inbreeding depression can appear. Fertility declines, litter sizes shrink, puppy mortality increases, immune resilience weakens. None of these changes announce themselves dramatically. They accumulate slowly, often explained away as coincidence, environment, or bad luck. Yet when viewed across decades rather than years, the pattern becomes unmistakable. Some international kennel organizations now recommend limiting the number of litters a single sire can produce, precisely because the long-term effects of overuse are so well documented. These recommendations exist not because excellence is undesirable, but because concentration without restraint destabilizes living systems. This is where the Victorian logic reveals itself most clearly. The assumption is that multiplying a superior individual improves the whole. The reality is that no single dog, no matter how beautiful or accomplished, carries all the traits necessary for long-term population health. When control tightens too much, resilience is lost. The lesson here is not that golden retrievers were bred incorrectly by bad actors. It is that even well-intentioned systems can produce harm when predictability and prestige are allowed to outweigh diversity and endurance. Life does not flourish through dominance of a single lineage. It flourishes through balance, restraint, and the humility to recognize that excellence must be distributed, not concentrated. That truth has been visible for a very long time. Number 10. Preservation itself is often misunderstood as freezing a system in place. In the Victorian era, institutions resisted change, not because evidence was lacking, but because alteration threatened legitimacy. Once a standard had been declared correct, revising that standard implied that earlier authorities had to be wrong. Stability was preserved by maintaining appearances, even when reality began to fracture beneath the surface. In modern dog breeding, this same belief appears whenever breed standards remain fixed despite clear evidence of their harm. The Chihuahua offers a particularly revealing example. Chihuahuas have been deliberately bred toward extreme small size for generations. The modern ideal emphasizes a tiny body, an exaggerated dome-shaped or apple head, large protruding eyes, and a compact frame that fits neatly into the human imagination of fragility and charm. These features are widely celebrated as hallmarks of the breed's identity. Yet the biological cost of this exaggeration is substantial. One of the most common and serious conditions in Chihuahuas is hydrocephalus, often described as, quote, water on the brain. In affected dogs, cerebrospinal fluid accumulates within the skull that is too small to accommodate it. The resulting pressure can cause seizures, disorientation, vision loss, chronic pain, and shortened lifespan. In severe cases, puppies fail to thrive at all. Closely related are Chiari-like malformation and syringomyelia, conditions in which the skull does not provide sufficient space for the brain, forcing tissue downward and disrupting normal fluid flow along the spinal cord. Fluid-filled cavities can form within the spinal cord itself, producing intense, ongoing pain. Dogs may exhibit head tilting, sensitivity to touch, phantom scratching, vocalization, or sudden behavioral changes that are frequently misunderstood or dismissed. These neurological conditions are not random. They are directly linked to skull shape and size. Skeletal fragility compounds this problem. Chihuahuas are prone to patellar luxation, where the kneecap slips out of place, causing pain and lameness that often requires surgical correction. Their bones fracture easily. Falls that would be inconsequential for larger dogs can result in serious injury for Chihuahuas. Many also retain an open frontanel or a soft spot on the skull that fails to close fully, leaving the brain permanently vulnerable. Despite decades of veterinary documentation, these risks persist because the breed standard itself continues to reward the very traits that create them. Extreme smallness is not treated as a warning sign, it is treated as refinement. Efforts to moderate size, skull shape, or structure often meet severe resistance. Breeders who produce slightly larger, sturdier dogs may be criticized for deviation from type. Dogs with healthier proportions can be excluded from breeding or competition because they do not conform closely enough to the established ideal. Preservation in this context becomes preservation of appearance rather than preservation of life. The situation is further complicated by popularity. Because Chihuahuas are fashionable and accessible, high-volume breeding is common. Health screening for neurological conditions is often absent or superficial, particularly in profit-driven settings. The emphasis remains on producing dogs that meet visual expectations quickly, not on addressing structural limitations that will require systemic change. This is the same logic Victorian institutions applied to their own standards. When outcomes became uncomfortable, the framework remained untouched. Responsibility was shifted away from the structure and onto circumstance, chance, or individual weakness. The Chihuahua is not unhealthy because it is small. It is unhealthy because smallness has been pushed beyond biological tolerance, and the system that rewards this exaggeration resists correction. Change threatens the idea of preservation, so the evidence is absorbed without action. This example makes the underlying principle visible. When preservation means keeping a standard exactly as it is, even when that standard produces harm, stewardship has been replaced by allegiance to the system. Life adapts, and standards must as well. And when they do not, fragility becomes inevitable, no matter how carefully the category itself is guarded. That is where preservation ends, and eugenics thinking quietly remains. Number 11. Another enduring belief carried forward from Victorian thinking is the idea that appearance reliably signals value. In the 19th century, refinement of form was often equated with refinement of character. A well-shaped skull, a polished posture, or a carefully cultivated look was assumed to reflect inner quality. This belief travels easily from people to animals. In modern dog breeding, this assumption appears whenever visual success is treated as proof of worth. Dogs that win in the ring are presumed superior than those who do not, while traits that are harder to measure, such as intelligence, endurance, and functional stability, quietly recede from importance. The Border Collie provides one of the most striking illustrations of this divide. Historically, the Border Collie was defined by function alone. It was shaped by its work. Sheep did not care about coat texture, markings, or outline. They responded to a dog's eye, balance, timing, and stamina. For generations, Border Collies were bred by shepherds who selected dogs based on their ability to gather, drive, hold pressure, and think independently over long hours in demanding terrain. Appearance varied widely because performance was the only standard that mattered. That began to change when formal conformation standards entered the picture. As the breed gained recognition in kennel clubs, especially with American Kennel Club acceptance, physical uniformity became a goal. A written standard replaced practical necessity. Judges needed something visible to evaluate, and so structure, coat, symmetry and presentation rose in importance. Over time, breeding decisions increasingly favored dogs that fit the visual ideal rather than those that excelled in the natural herding work. The result is a clear divergence. Working bred border collies tend to be lighter, leaner, and intensely focused. Their coats are practical rather than ornamental. Their intelligence is sharp and situational, shaped by constant problem solving. These dogs often possess extraordinary stamina and sensibility, traits essential for livestock work but demanding in everyday households. Showbred border collies, by contrast, are selected primarily for appearance. Heavier coats, more uniform markings, and a particular outline are rewarded. Temperament is often softened to suit companion settings, and working drive is no longer essential for breeding approval. These dogs may still resemble border collies, but many lack the instinct, endurance, and mental intensity that originally defined the breed. This divide has not gone unnoticed. Many working border collie organizations openly reject Kennel Club recognition altogether. Registries such as the International Sheepdog Society define the breed strictly by working ability, refusing to register dogs based on appearance alone. Their concern is not nostalgia, it is preservation of function. They understand that once selection pressure shifts away from work, the instincts that made the breed exceptional in the first place begin to erode. Health concerns follow closely behind. In some show lines, higher inbreeding coefficients have been documented as breeders concentrate on a narrow subset of dogs that constantly win in the ring. Genetic diversity narrows. Meanwhile, traits that support resilience, adaptability, and sustained performance receive less attention because they are not visible in the show ring. What makes the Border Collie example so instructive is that nothing about this outcome was malicious. Breeders believed they were refining the breed. Judges believed they were preserving type. Registrars believed that they were providing legitimacy. Each step sounded reasonable, yet the outcome reveals the flaw in the entire system's premise. When appearance becomes the primary measure of value, function becomes optional. And when function becomes optional, the breed's original purpose becomes symbolic rather than real. What remains is a visual representation of a once working dog rather than the working dog itself. This mirrors Victorian logic precisely. Refinement was assumed to equal improvement, even when the underlying capacity weakened. The category still survived, though, but the essence diminished. The Border Collie teaches a sobering lesson. A breed can look intact while losing what made it exceptional. Uniformity can increase while capability declines. And when that happens, the system will still appear successful because it continues to produce dogs that meet its own criteria. The dogs, however, tell a different story. They always do. This is why the question is never whether structure should exist. The question is whether structure remains accountable to the outcome. When it does not, appearance becomes a stand-in for value, and preservation quietly gives way to performance theater. That shift is not unique to Border Collies. It is simply easier to see there in that breed, because the contrast between form and function is impossible to ignore. Number 12. Finally, there is the belief that harmful outcomes are unfortunate but necessary. Victorian eugenics accepted suffering as the price of progress. This belief did not arrive suddenly, nor did it begin with cruelty. It emerged gradually, dressed in the language of progress. In the Victorian era, eugenics grew out of a sincere desire to improve society. Industrialization had transformed cities almost overnight. Poverty, disease, and overcrowding were visible everywhere. Reformers wanted solutions that felt orderly and scientific rather than chaotic and reactive. They believed that suffering could be reduced if populations were shaped deliberately instead of left to chance. At first, the argument sounded compassionate. If weakness could be bred out, fewer people would suffer in the future. If undesirable traits could be prevented, society would become healthier, more efficient, and more humane. Short-term pain was reframed as an investment in long-term improvement. This is where the turn occurred. Once improvement became the goal, suffering became negotiable. Hardship was no longer a warning sign. It was reinterpreted as evidence that the process was working. Individuals who struggled were described as unfortunate examples of a necessary transition. Their pain was treated as temporary noise on the path toward a refined future. Victorian institutions absorbed this logic quickly. Poorhouses separated families under the belief that dependency needed correction. Asylums confined people deemed unfit, often indefinitely, because exclusion was considered protection for the society. Forced sterilization was later justified as prevention rather than punishment. Each step was defended as rational. Each step placed the system above the individual. What made the philosophy so durable was its tone. It did not sound cruel at the time. It sounded disciplined. It promised eventual relief. It reassured society that suffering was regrettable but unavoidable if improvement was to continue. That reasoning did not disappear, it simply migrated. Because in modern dog breeding, the same idea appears whenever chronic suffering is treated as an acceptable trade-off for maintaining a type. Phrases such as, quote, "every breed has its problems," serve the same function Victorian reformers once used. They acknowledge harm while quietly removing responsibility to change the structure that produced it. Brachiocephalic breeds offer a clear illustration. Dogs struggle to breathe, regulate temperature, exercise normally, or give birth without surgical intervention. These outcomes are not rare anomalies in the brachiocephalic breed category. They are often widespread and predictable. Yet they are often described as inherent characteristics rather than consequences of selective pressure. The logic follows a similar path. The dogs suffer, but the breed is preserved. The discomfort is regrettable, but the look is valued. The lifespan is shortened, but the type remains intact. Progress defined narrowly as visual consistency continues forward while the cost is absorbed by the animals themselves. This is not framed as neglect. It is framed as acceptance. Acceptance becomes a shield that prevents deeper questioning. If suffering is inevitable, then no correction is required. If it is normal, then responsibility dissolves. Victorian eugenics relied on the same mechanism. Once pain was labeled necessary, the system no longer needed to listen to those experiencing it. Improvement became theatrical rather than lived. The future was protected at the expense of the present. The danger of this mindset lies in its patience. It allows harm to persist indefinitely because tomorrow is always invoked as the justification. The promise of eventual progress excuses current damage even when the damage repeats generation after generation. When applied to dogs, this philosophy produces populations that survive only through intervention. Surgery replaces function. Medication replaces resilience. Management replaces adaptability. The system continues to operate, but the animals pay the price. True stewardship does not require suffering as proof of seriousness. It does not treat harm as an entry fee for preservation. It recognizes that when pain becomes routine, the design itself demands revision. Progress that consumes the living beings it claims to improve is not progress at all. It is simply a well-organized way to look away from the problem. This is where Victorian eugenics lost its moral footing, and it is where modern breeding frameworks face the same test. When suffering is tolerated rather than confronted, refinement has already crossed into failure, no matter how polished the result appears. Beneath all 12 of these ideas runs the same quiet pattern. They persist because they initially sound responsible. They promise order, predictability, and control. Yet when judged by outcomes rather than intention, they consistently produce fragility, suffering, and collapse over time. Dogs do not argue with the systems that create them. They cannot. They simply live with the consequences. And that reality invites a final honest question. When these ideas surface in modern breeding conversations, do they still feel complete to you? Or do they feel like echoes of a philosophy that has outlived its usefulness? But the good news is there is a better way. Nature has already written the blueprint for sustaining life with strength, stability, and genetic depth. It does this without committees, trophies, or fashionable standards. It does it through patterns that repeat across every healthy population on Earth. Because life that cannot endure does not get to keep its name. Eugenics at its core is an argument that human design can outperform nature's blueprint. That man can outthink the rules that have carried species through famine, plague, climate shifts, and the long grind of time. History has not been kind to that claim. Whenever we have tried to force life into a narrow human ideal, the outcome has rarely been vigor. It has usually been fragility, hidden breakdown, and suffering that gets explained away as unfortunate but expected. Stewardship begins when we humble ourselves enough to admit this. Nature is not careless, and its mechanisms are not accidental. Nature preserves identity while preventing collapse. It builds type while protecting function. It values structure, yet it refuses to seal any living population so tightly that it cannot breathe. When we look closely at that pattern, we find fundamental truths that directly counter the eugenics ideals born in the Victorian age and still linger in modern dog breeding today. Strongbred is simply a deliberate return to those natural breeding truths, applied with intention, transparency, and long view responsibility. Number 1, Strongbred preserves life first, and it treats pedigree as secondary evidence. A eugenic framework quietly ranks lives by prestige, rarity, and the social value of a name. Strongbred reserves the direction of loyalty. It asks what the dog experiences across a full life, including breathing, movement, fertility, pain, behavioral stability, recovery from stress, and the ability to age with dignity. If a rare line cannot consistently produce dogs who live well, that line is not a treasure. It is a warning for the breed. Pedigree can describe where a dog came from, but it cannot justify repeating predictable suffering. Number 2, Strongbred prizes resilience over short-term predictability. Predictability is tempting because it feels like control, and control feels like safety. Nature does not chase tight predictability because environments change faster than any ideal can keep up. Strongbred still builds consistency, but it builds it through traits that remain functional under pressure, such as sound structure, stable temperament, robust immunity, and reproductive health. A population that looks uniform but breaks down early is a brittle display. A population that holds together across time is a stewardship made visible. Number 3, Strongbred treats genetic diversity as a protected asset, not a contamination. Closed purity is not a virtue in living systems. It is a narrowing hallway that eventually ends in a locked door. Strongbred uses thoughtful distance the way wild canids do when a mature animal ranges outward, mates beyond the familiar range, and brings vigor back without dissolving the identity of the entire population. This is the difference between losing type and renewing it. Diversity is not chaos when it is guided. It is the oxygen that keeps a lineage from suffocating itself. Number 4, Strongbred treats carefully designed outcrossing as a corrective medicine, not degeneration. Fear of mixing often rests on the belief that identity is fragile. Healthy identity is not fragile. Strongbred is willing to introduce new genetics when the population shows systemic breakdown, and then it returns to structure and selection to rebuild predictability around health, temperament, and type. This is not random crossbreeding. It is not a purity ideal either. It is population care with a plan. Number 5, Strongbred refuses cosmetic exclusion when it costs biological viability. Eugenic thinking removes dogs from superficial deviation because uniformity becomes the moral good. Strongbred treats health and function as the gate, and it treats appearance as a secondary layer that can be stabilized over time. If a dog is sound, stable, long-lived, and capable, removing it over a cosmetic feature is not refinement. It is waste, genetic waste. The goal is not to preserve a look at the expense of life. The goal is to preserve a population that it can reliably produce dogs worth living in it. Number 6, Strongbred treats suffering as a design failure, never at the price of refinement. When a system normalizes breathing distress, surgical reproduction, chronic pain, neurological impairment, and shortened lifespan, it is confessing that it has chosen an ideal over the creature. Strongbred draws a bright line in the sand here. If the standard requires routine medical intervention for ordinary life, then the standard is wrong. True refinement produces easier lives, not harder ones. It produces animals that can function without constant rescue from their own anatomy. Number 7, Strongbred treats recurring failure as system feedback, not individual shame. When the same diseases, temperament collapses, fertility problems, or structural weaknesses appear repeatedly, Strongbred does not blame the dog, the owner, or the weather. It reads the pattern as information. It asks what choices amplified risk and what corrective measures will reduce it. This is what good husbandry has always done. A wise steward does not scold the canary. A wise steward checks the air. Number 8, Strongbred rejects authority as a substitute for evidence. Titles, registry approval, and prestige can be useful signals, but they are never the final verdict. Strongbred treats measurable outcomes as the highest authority, including longevity data, orthopedic durability, reproductive health, behavioral stability, and reduction of known inherited disease. When tradition disagrees with outcomes, Strongbred follows the outcomes, not tradition. That is how you prevent institutions from becoming echo chambers that reward themselves while the dogs pay the bill. Number 9, Strongbred limits genetic domination and distributes excellence. Popular sire syndrome is a perfect example of how a system can be sincere and still be destructive. Strongbred builds restraint into the philosophy so that no single dog becomes the genetic bottleneck of the future. Excellence is spread across multiple lines, and breeding decisions are made with population health in view rather than short-term fashion. A strong population is not a monument to one champion. It is a wide, stable landscape of good dogs. Number 10. Strongbred updates standards when evidence shows that they are harmful. Preservation does not mean freezing a standard in amber. It means preserving the living thing the standard was supposed to serve. Strongbred treats standards as hypotheses, not scripture. If a trait is linked to pain, disability, reproductive failure, or early death, then the responsible response is revision of the standard. This is how nature behaves. Life adapts or it disappears. Stewardship must adapt as well. Number 11. Strongbred treats function as the proof of identity, and appearance as the servant of function. The Border Collie split shows what happens when the appearance becomes the definition of a working animal. Strongbred insists that the core of a breed, or developing breed, is what it can reliably be in real life, such as a stable companion dog, a capable working partner, a sound mover, a healthy reproducer, and a long-lived family member. When function is protected, appearance can be shaped over time without sacrificing the engine inside the frame. When appearance is protected first, well, then function becomes theater. Number 12. Strongbred treats restraint as the clearest sign of responsibility. Eugenic systems often equate strict exclusion with virtue. Strongbred equates responsibility with humility, transparency, and restraint. It requires breeders to say no to convenient pairings, no to the fashion of the day, and no to shortcomings that mortgage the future. It also requires the courage to correct course publicly when evidence demands it. Restriction for its own sake is not care. Care is choosing the hard right over the easy shiny and doing it consistently for decades. So, the initial question we posed at the beginning of this video still lingers quietly but persistently. Do you believe in eugenics? Most people don't think they do. Unfortunately, they've inherited assumptions instead. They absorb established language that sounds full of care and responsibility. They trust the long-held belief systems that promise order, predictability, and control. Over time, those established systems stop being questioned, even when the living beings inside them begin to struggle. The truth is simple and uncomfortable. Eugenics does not announce itself with cruelty, just as it did at the start of the Victorian era after Darwin's genetic discoveries. It arrives dressed as stewardship. It survives by sounding sensible, and it endures wherever outcomes are tolerated rather than examined. The Direwolf Project exists because we chose to examine breeding outcomes instead of standing with long-held breeding traditions simply because they were well established. Instead of adhering to Victorian notions of purity and pedigree, we chose to ask whether dogs are breathing easily, moving soundly, reproducing naturally, aging comfortably, and living full lives alongside the families who love them. We chose to place a life well lived ahead of labels, health ahead of prestige, and long-view stewardship ahead of short-term certainty. In doing so, we stepped outside every modern framework that still clings to Victorian thinking today, not to reject the structure, but to restore its purpose. As of today, the Direwolf Project stands alone as the only modern dog breed development program intentionally applying these principles within a disciplined selective breeding framework. Not through purebred crossing within the crossbred community, not through seeking ultimate purebred status, but through a system designed to preserve identity while preventing genetic health and/or temperament collapse. Exactly the way nature has sustained life for millennia. We stand in active rebellion against both modern dog breeding ideologies of our day, purebred and crossbred status, and instead humbly present a third option, the strongbred dog, nature's way, and ultimately God's breeding plan. If this video unsettled you in any way, it is very well could be the sound of inherited ideas loosening their grip on you. Questions like these do not ask for allegiance, but they do ask for honesty. Some ideas survive because they are just written down. Others survive because someone is willing to live them openly, carefully, and without apology. This is one of those ideas. We are not purebred. We are not crossbred. We are strongbred.